Hello and welcome to the Business of Story. I'm Park Howell, and you know what? For over 8 years, I have brought you story artists from around the world to help you craft and tell compelling stories that sell. This is your home to hear experts from the fields of branding, advertising, sales, marketing, leadership, learning and development, and the arts and sciences provide actionable storytelling tips to help you excel through the stories you tell. Today, we cover the art of the question with the author of the book by the same name, Sean Grace. It's important to know how to ask better questions and to understand the consequences if you don't, because what you glean from the questions you ask will help you determine what stories to tell to influence and persuade your audience. But what I found most interesting in my conversation with Sean is asking the right question starts by asking questions of yourself, of your beliefs, biases, and dare I say, neuroses. Hey, it's Halloween week 2024. So I thought I'd celebrate with you by sharing a tale about Dan Aykroyd and his Crystal Head vodka from my book, Brand Bewitchery. Aykroyd grew up in a home in Ottawa, Canada, where his folks produced regular seances, scouted for Sasquatches, and scanned the skies for UFOs. So he naturally gravitated to these otherworldly beliefs when he designed the brand purpose behind his Crystal Head vodka. Here's his story at the beginning of Chapter 9 called The Moral: How to Declare Your Brand's Purpose to Amplify Your Impact. When I think of consumer commodities, I think of bottled water, aspirin, and vodka. Not necessarily in that order. But how do you create meaning for an inherently meaningless product to create a premium offering? You craft a compelling brand story based on the purpose that is expressed through your product. That's what this chapter is all about, finding the purpose that propels your brand. Because as you'll soon see, your customers buy your story before they buy your offering. This brand story concept has never been more underscored to me than by listening to celebrity Dan Aykroyd pitch his Crystal Head vodka on the Joe Rogan Show. You can learn a ton from this gifted brand storyteller about how to spin meaning into your merchandise. The entertaining 2-hour episode rollicks through his beliefs and experiences. Aykroyd spoke at length about his religion of following spiritualists and mediums. He wrote Ghostbusters because he was raised in Ottawa, Canada, in a family that routinely performed seances and hung out with mediums. He believes in Sasquatch and has had 3 of his own close encounters with unidentified flying objects. But Aykroyd started the show shilling his premium vodka called Crystal Head. This award-winning vodka is an expression of his purpose, which is, as I understand it, to tap into the unseen forces to elevate your understanding and therefore your life. When it comes to selling an expensive commodity, I can't think of a bigger task than hawking a $55 bottle of vodka. According to the Planet Money Show on National Public Radio, a federal law requires all vodka to be pretty much the same. Vodka must be distilled or treated until it is, quote, without distinctive character, aroma, taste, or color, end quote. Some distillers will add flavor packs, which is a separate category outside of, quote, pure vodka. The Planet Money team wanted to test this, so they bought some vodka concentrate and added water to create their homemade booze. Then they sent it to the White Labs in San Diego for a comprehensive spirits test. Along with their bathtub batch, they sent a sample of the cheapest vodka they could find and a sample of the ultra-luxury brand Grey Goose. Guess which one of these 3 vodkas came in third for taste? Yep, Grey Goose. Intoxicating brand storytelling. Given this insight, I was intrigued by how Aykroyd told the story of his ultra-premium Crystal Head vodka. His vodka has been on the market for 11 years and is in 70 countries with over 50 million bottles sold. It won the gold medal for excellent taste at the 2013 Prod Expo exhibition in Moscow out of 400 vodkas. But what is even more impressive than the success of his tasteless spirit is his brand storytelling. Aykroyd extolled the virtues of their process on The Joe Rogan Show.
And what we do is we take peaches and cream corn from Chatham, Ontario, and we put it in the truck in the mash, and we ship it 95% alcohol volume at that point, and we take it over and we put it in the ferry boat, and we bring it over to the distillery in Newfoundland, Canada, one of the last state-owned stills in the world. And why are we there? Because the water from the original Wisconsin glacier is under Newfoundland. So vodka is an old Russian word for water. And great,
really?
Yeah, and great vodkas have sweet water. I want you to just take a sip, and then I'm going to make a nice crystal drop. But here's our notes.
Cheers, sir.
Just a sip.
Aykroyd went on to describe how his vodka has a sweet vanilla dry crisp with a kick of heat off the finish, flavor profiles created by Anthony Dias Blue. But wait, the brand storytelling only gets better. Aykroyd says that after distilling, they filter their vodka by pouring it over Herkimer diamonds. Not surprisingly, Rogan jumps on the thought. You pour it over diamonds? He asks. I'll let the former Bassomatic salesman take it from here as he shares with you how they craft brand meaning for their vodka through diamonds and UFOs.
We distill and we filter, and we pour it over Herkimer diamonds.
Diamonds?
Yep.
You pour it over diamonds?
We do. We pour it over the Herkimer semi-precious stone, and the Herkimer semi-precious stone is one of our last purification processes. Now, if you asked a high school professor, what does pouring alcohol over diamonds do to the alcohol, they'd probably say, well, nothing, but our stones, after a certain number of pours, they turn yellow, and we have to bleach them, clean them, or replace them. The Herkimer diamond is found in an anomalous area of upstate New York, also in Afghanistan and in Oaxaca, Mexico. They're found. They're little semi-precious, double-ended crystals, and people love the taste of the vodka poured over the stones. Now,
is there a chemical reaction that causes the stones to turn yellow, or is it?
You'd have to sit with a chemistry professor and say, why does the alcohol turn the crystals yellow? Is it doing anything? Is it purifying it? We've done flavor profiles where we pour it over the stones and give it to people, and we don't pour it over the stones and give it to the people, and they like it better poured over the stones. Now, why I like the Herkimer diamond is, of course, because it's near Griffiths Air Force Base, Rome, New York.
Dun, dun, dun.
And that was where a lot of scrambles went up in the 70s and 80s against whatever was coming and going, and in the mountains there, Pine Bluff, or Pine Bush, New York,
folklore.
Pine Bush, New York. So I thought, this is great. Herkimer diamonds from that area associated with ETs, the Navajo, the Aztec, the Anasazi. They said that these skulls came down to them from the Star Children. They were given to them as scrying devices to help the tribe move forward, to give positive energy to the tribe. And so I thought, perfect tie-in. We pour our vodka over Herkimer diamonds. We're tied in a little to the extraterrestrial legend there with the skull, and it's the neat kind of bow to our product. But the most important thing is that the fluid in the bottle matches the beauty of the bottle, and the bottle is to sell the idea of purity and enlightened thinking, enlightened drinking, which was what these skulls were made for. Gosh, it's good even without the orange juice.
Dan Aykroyd, you might be the greatest salesman that's ever lived. I'm sold.
The thinking behind the skull. Crystal Head Vodka is brilliantly packaged in an artisan skull bottle designed by notable Texas artist John Alexander, inspired by the crystal skull legend. The crystal skulls are human skull hard stone carvings made of clear or milky white quartz, also called rock crystal. According to National Geographic, many believe these skulls were carved thousands of years ago by an ancient Mesoamerican civilization. Others think they may be relics from the legendary island of Atlantis, or proof that extraterrestrials visited the Aztecs sometime before the Spanish conquest. However, these claims have been refuted for all the specimens made available for scientific studies. But what a story! And the folks at Crystal Head Vodka are undeterred. They have grown a community of bartenders they call Startenders, who share their unique experiences with this otherworldly brand. Quote, "We are the vodka for the creative spirit," Aykroyd declares. He said the spirit comes from two artists, a writer and a graphic artist who is also a designer, painter, and sculptor. And then he defined the purpose behind the Crystal Head brand. Enlightened drinking for the creative spirit. This is the power of a brand story told on purpose. Crystal Head Vodka is a clear example of how brand storytelling can levitate your brand's position in the marketplace for incredible success. Because, as Aykroyd has proved, people will buy your story before they buy your product. And while you might be calling BS on his story, Aykroyd is simply sharing his true beliefs and mystical forces to sell his spirits. It's authentic to him, whether you believe it or not, and there's nothing wrong with that. And if you do believe, well, the sky's the limit. Hey, if you're so inclined, raise a ghoulish toast this week to Halloween with your own bottle of Crystal Head vodka. Now, Aykroyd obviously pulled his brand from his personal experiences growing up. His beliefs, his biases, and some might call his neuroses are embodied in his Crystal Head brand. I mean, they really are what underscore the purpose of the product. That's why Sean Grace recommends that you do some significant introspection of your three minds, as he calls them: your thinking mind, feeling mind, and observing mind, to recognize any personal biases that might color the questions you ask of others. Because you want to be asking the right questions of them to understand which stories to tell so that you can ultimately influence and persuade them to action.
All of us have some of this, right? Where we become completely entangled with our anxieties, our thoughts, and our feelings. And it's hard for us to pull out of those states. However, the more you practice this observing self, the more agency you have to say, okay, I am feeling this way, or I am thinking like this, but that's okay. It's over here. It's not who I am. It doesn't define who I am at this moment. So that type of objectivity and separation is where the concept of the noticing and observing self comes from. And from that, Zen Buddhism talks about you're then less susceptible to being pulled in directions that are not productive and don't lead you into positive states of mind.
Sean is a communications consultant, author, coach, and speaker with over 25 years of experience developing and training sales, marketing, and leadership talent across diverse industries. His unique brand of business consulting is forged from his long career in media, advertising, and the creative arts. Sean studied music performance at the Juilliard School and SUNY Purchase. That's SUNY Purchase. And he studied finance at Wharton. As an award-winning musician and multi-instrumentalist, he borrows techniques from jazz improvisation to help foster creative collaboration and cooperation within and across teams. Sean's track record of success as a consultant and coach has earned him a reputation as a trusted advisor and trainer to some of the world's most innovative and successful organizations. So please welcome to the Business of Story, the author of The Art of the Question, Sean Grace. Hello, Sean. Welcome to the Business of Story.
Thank you very much, Park. Thanks so much for having me. I'm happy to be here.
And where are you coming to us from?
Philadelphia.
Oh, Philly.
Pennsylvania.
Yeah. How are your Eagles doing this year?
You know, I hate to say it, but I'm not that on top of what's going on sports-wise here in Philly. And you know, it's an embarrassment because Philly is a very, enthusiastic sports town. But I have to say I've been a little less engaged with the teams, and I'm rather new to Philly. A few years now. I moved from New York, so I'm still getting acclimated a bit. So that's my excuse.
No, you don't need an excuse. I hear you. I'm a big football fan. I like the NFL, but I don't know. It's a product that eats itself. You know, these guys out there just sacrifice their bodies and all kinds of injuries, and it's kind of hard to watch, quite honestly. And then, of course, I'm a big NCAA football fan, but what the media networks have done to destroy NCAA football has kind of made me reluctant to watch that too. So I might become way less of a sports fan like you, Sean.
Well, it's not like something I decided to, change my focus or interest in. It's I've never necessarily been a follower of too many sports teams.
Yeah. Well, you're a follower of music. I mean, you studied music at the acclaimed Juilliard School of Music. What did you play?
My main instrument is flute.
Uh-huh.
But I play piano and guitar, percussion, bass, a variety of other instruments as well. But the main instrument that I'm trained on classically is the flute.
And what did you do after graduating from Juilliard?
Well, I didn't graduate from Juilliard. I only went to I spent 4 years at their pre-college when I was, before I was in high school, actually. So I spent weekends there throughout my high school. And then I went to Purchase College, New York, which was more my speed at that point. I had a jazz program where Juilliard did not have a jazz program. I felt I had spent enough time in the conservatory world, and I wanted to work with a broader spectrum of players, and Purchase allowed me to do that. It had quite an array of programs, which basically expanded from world music to jazz to classical, etc. And it was not far from Manhattan, so I was able to still tap into some of the teachers that I utilized for years at the Juilliard School, and Purchase program was such that there was an affiliation between any of the conservatories in Manhattan. So it all worked out for me in the end, at least from the musical education standpoint.
Well, as a youth, you must have been a very gifted and very hard-working musician, because those are the only ones that get to that level.
Well, I certainly took to it pretty early, and I was obsessed with it at a very early age. So that put me in a mode of practice and discipline and focus, starting probably at 9 or 10 years old, if not, well, probably 8 years old, really. So that, yeah, it was a huge part of my idea of the world around me, and I got a tremendous amount of satisfaction from it. So, so I was able to hone maybe some natural skills that I had, and then be able to really leverage those throughout different performance opportunities as well as my educational opportunities.
And are you still performing today?
I am.
Yeah.
I'm not very active right now. I'm not doing too many shows these days, but I'm still doing studio work and production work, and I have a few projects I'm working on in the studio now. Hopefully something will come out in the new year. And I did produce a Latin jazz record a couple of years ago, so then I toured that a little bit, but not much. But currently more in the author mode as opposed to the musical performance mode.
Yeah. Well, I was going to ask you, how did you transition from being a musician into the business world, running Peak Luna Media, and of course the book we're going to talk about, The Art of the Question: A Guide for Seekers, Dreamers, Problem Solvers, and Leaders?
Well, it's been a long journey, to say the least. Certainly you mentioned, and we just talked about my musical education, but out of college, I realized that making a good living as a musician was tough. So I supplemented that with a job in sales, and turns out I was pretty good at that. So I quickly became sort of in a management role for training salespeople at a very young age, while at the same time I had a sort of this side parallel musical career. But I was making more money in sales and marketing, and I decided, hey, why don't I just continue pursuing that as well? So I ended up building a career in publishing around advertising sales, marketing, and media in general. And what was nice about that is I spent many years running magazines in the entertainment arena and the music arena and film and television. So I was able to, sort of bring two of the worlds together to a certain degree, and that was quite satisfying. So I was able to kind of keep those two careers alive. However, my business career was much more lucrative than my musical career, which to a certain degree you could say allowed me to choose the projects I wanted to artistically and pursue independent projects as opposed to needing to work jobs musically that may not have been that satisfying. So I guess if you look at it that way, I had sort of the best of both worlds.
And now the book, The Art of the Question. Is this your first book?
It is my first book, something I always in the back of my head wanted to do or thought of maybe someday doing, and but was able to bring it to fruition very recently after many years of research and a full year plus of daily writing and editing.
Oh, yeah. I know how that goes, having a few books of my own. But why did you take on this particular subject?
Yeah, well, after I left the media, well, I should say the publishing industry, which sort of fell apart in the magazine world some 20 years ago, I started my own consultancy called Grace Media Works, which was to help some of the more traditional publishers transition to the digital world. I began working with more and more clients as a consultant. And in that process, I started to recognize once again the power of questions in discovering where needs are and to be able to be more efficient in understanding needs assessments and things such as that. Now, a lot of those skills I had developed in the world of sales and in the world of management and leadership, and I was able to bring it more purposefully over to the world of consulting. So then several years after that, I was started doing workshops and producing workshops for leadership development programs across a variety of companies. And most of it was in the communication realm. Storytelling was part of that as well, but persuasion and all things communication, essentially. And questions kept sort of being, at least the way I was presenting a lot of the material, became a central aspect and catalyst for how these ideas were explored. So because of feedback, it seemed like, wow, people wanted to know more about this skill and this art of asking questions. So I said, well, maybe I'll create a workshop. So about 5-6 years ago, I created a workshop called The Art of the Question. And with that, after several hundred participants coming and going and getting good feedback on what's working and what's not, I had a whole lot of material that I had developed over many years and then refined in the workshops and said, hey, maybe there's a book here.
Mm-hmm.
So that was where the book came from, really came out of those workshops and the fact that questioning was such a central aspect of my communication training.
So the title of the show, of course, is How to Ask Better Questions and What Happens When You Don't. Let's start with the what happens when you don't.
Well, I guess it all comes down to what you're trying to achieve, right? I have a fairly broad acceptance of types of questions. So when it comes to a wrong question, that's a little hard for me to completely, comprehend because there's always something to a question that will spark a response or a conversation that could lead to other areas. So I rarely come across a situation where I say, well, that's a bad question. However, there are more efficient questions and there are wrong questions from the sense that if you're trying to solve a problem, for instance, and that could be anything from a real hard, actual deductive type of problem solving to a more human relationship type of problem solving. The first question I always ask is this the right question to be asking? And often, well, a lot of times, and maybe often, it turns out that there may be a better question to ask. And however, that first question may not be a wrong question or a bad question. It may not be the absolute best question for the answer you're hoping to achieve. So Socrates gave us some of the basics to how to understand if it's the right question or not. And in the book, I talk about what I call the Socratic 8. And the first being, is this the right question to ask? And there are 7 then subsequent questions to find out if in fact it is the right question to ask.
Can you go through those 7 real quick? You don't have to explain each one, but I'm very interested, especially in the Socratic method, because I would imagine when you are the leader and you're asking the questions, you are being driven by some hidden biases, your own biases that may then corrupt that question and not get you to the answer you really actually need to move forward. So what are those 8 Socratic ways of thinking about, is this the right question?
Well, they're based on what Socrates thought were 4 directions of thought. And the first direction of thought was the origin or the purpose of what you're trying to achieve, right? So what's the motivation, the origin, and the purpose of this? The second aspect has to do with the evidence or the data related to what supports this question and this idea or this theory. The third area has to do with perspective and point of view. And that is questions that would relate to, are you looking at it from the right way, and what would an opposite way look like? So you take different perspectives on how to approach the evidence that you've laid out before you. And then finally, an area regarding consequence, and that is, how does this all play out if in fact this is true or not? So from that, you break out, so those are sort of like the 4 basic directions of a thought or a theory or an idea or a question. And then from there, you break out several questions per area to kind of drill down a little further. And there's different frameworks to kind of work that through, depending on if you're, again, deductive reasoning through trying to solve a knowable problem, or if it's something that you're trying to discern, trying to discover something or innovate, where your thinking process is more divergent versus convergent. So it depends on where you're going with your questioning. Are you leading to a point, or are you trying to explore and open up ideas?
So how to ask better questions, or the art of the question, really begins by first asking yourself these questions and try to sort out what it is you're trying to accomplish and what questions are going to be the best stepping stones to get you there, right?
Right.
I mean, that's, I would imagine, is really hard for a lot of people if they haven't gone through like a course like yours or read your book or whatever, that you could get lost in the weeds of asking yourself these questions. How do you keep that from happening?
Yeah. Well, there are question types. The interrogatives are the main ones, right? Your who, what, where, when, why, and how. Each of those interrogative question types will direct your questioning in a different way. And I talk in the book about, especially when it comes to interpersonal relationships, how why questions can be problematic in the world of interpersonal communication. And why that happens is because how someone receives a why question, especially if it's about behavior or something in the interpersonal human aspect of the relationship, they could very easily sort of put their guard up and feel like as if they're being accused of something. So for instance, if you and your partner come home after an evening out and you turn to your partner and say, why is this house always a mess? Now, you're likely not really looking for a root cause, but you're using the why as sort of a passive-aggressive way to accuse the other person, potentially, of... Now they may receive that and say, yeah, you're right, or they may very well not. And then you turns into an argument where the two of you are arguing over who does what, when, where, and how. Whereas instead of a why question, if you used a how question, that could completely change the complexion of how the question is received. So if you came home, same situation, you look around and you might say, how do you think we can keep the house cleaner? Or how do you think we can, keep the place more together, or whatever the case might be? Now, what happens there is there's 2 things that happens. Is it doesn't wrap the question around the person that you're presenting it to, whereas a why question can do that. It can wrap the problem around the person, which then causes them to be defensive. A how question is more prescriptive, and it looks for a solution to a problem. And it moves the problem out of the person's person. So it's over there. It's a behavior, for instance. Here's the thing. How can we maybe together figure this out? Or how can we go about correcting this, right? Or how can you go about correcting whatever but how is often a more motivating and productive question than a why. Now, of course, why is a very potent question when it comes to understanding purpose. Why are we doing this? Why do I get up in the morning? These are fundamental questions. And there's books written, start with why, right?
Yeah.
And there's certainly there's merit to that. But when it comes to human relationships, there may be better substitutes depending on what you're trying to achieve. So there's the types, there's the framing, and these are all ways to figure out how better to ask a question that will get to what it is you're hoping to achieve, as opposed to maybe creating a question that's going to take you longer to get there.
So you really have to do a lot of soul searching in a leadership realm, in a partnership realm, or whatever, when you are addressing a challenge, or you've got an opportunity ahead of you that you want to embrace to get the other people on board. You've got to first do that soul searching to understand what is my exact outcome I'm looking for, and what questions are going to get a positive conversation going towards that end.
Yes, and in the book, I dedicate a chapter called Know Thyself, and it talks a lot about what we call metacognitive skills. And these are the skills that allow us to rise above our own selves and look back and ask ourselves questions, such as, is this the best approach to this circumstance? Is this the best way to approach solving this problem? Have I been here before? Have I seen this before? And is the next question I ask this person the best way to frame this question? So these are self-questioning that does essentially point to having you evaluate, is there a better way to frame or direct this question?
Yeah. Now, the reason why I wanted to get you on the show here is I thought this was fascinating. We had never really covered this idea of how to arrive at the best questions. This is a business of story, but we're all living in our own stories and our own narratives. And if you are trying to bring a team into that narrative to get them to do something new, maybe it's a change initiative, maybe it's a customer service challenge that you're trying to fix, maybe it's you want a 4x revenue and the sales team isn't quite there. It's the stories that you invite them into. But if you are asking the wrong story or the wrong questions, then you are kind of setting yourself up for failure, because maybe all of a sudden they will see the narrative differently, and maybe in a not so positive way as you see it, because that couching of the question essentially colors the story or the narrative you're trying to get them involved in.
Correct. Yeah, the question is going to essentially draw the frame that the picture is going to be then created around. Reminds me of one of a sales meeting that I had when I was very young, and I was a young sales manager. I just come onto this company, and I had a small team, probably 6 salespeople under me, and sales were not looking good. Right? We weren't hitting our numbers, and I was on, I don't know, maybe just a month or so. And I had a sales meeting with the team, and I went around the table and I said, so, why are your sales down? And they began telling why sales were down. It's the market, it's the competition, it's the economy, it's this, it's that, And then I went to the next person. They said, well, we have some new competition in the territory. We had some key advertisers pull out. We have some pressure from digital, blah, blah, blah. Around the table it went, and each one built upon the other. And I listened and I said, wow, okay, this is a tough situation that we're in here. And you guys are all professionals, and you guys have been working here for a while. And man, I'll just have to, receive and accept what it is that you're saying. But then I stood up and I went to the whiteboard and I took out a marker and I said, how might we reach and exceed our sales goals for the year? And I sat back down and I started over. I said, now, can you answer that question? And they said, well, and this is a harder thing to do because they just spent 20 minutes telling me all the reasons why their sales were off. And it was, pretty depressing. However, well, let's see, how might we? Well, we might be able to introduce a new, product, a new section in some of the magazines, blah, blah, blah. We could probably do this. There's some ways we can create some incentives. We could create a new event. Before you know it, were moving around the room, and each one started building upon the other. And then within 20 minutes, we had a good 20 ideas that I was writing down. And those ideas, a good 5 or 6 of them, were good, solid ideas on how to achieve our sales goals. And what that taught me once again was the power of switching from a why is this happening to how can we move in this other direction, which essentially sparked a completely different line of thinking. Now, their imaginations and their creativity were working equally as hard in both question sets. So one was why, and they dug deep and they found all the reasons why. And they were all legitimate reasons. There was no reason there that I could say that's not legitimate. It was all legitimate. However, they used the same amount of firepower in their heads to come up with ideas on how to achieve the goal and not to look back and figure out excuses why it wasn't happening. Mm-hmm. So this was a powerful lesson as a leader and a manager in helping others reflect upon themselves by questioning, to have them come up with solutions to their own problems, or in those cases, my problem as well, which was, of course, achieving the sales goals for the year.
And so it sounds like you were able to toggle them from actually a scarcity mindset to more of an abundance mindset, just simply in how you first approach the question. But you had to ask that why question first just to get to the bottom of the problem.
Well, I guess there's certainly some utility to the why question. I understood peripherally, what the pressures were, and I knew that really what we needed were solutions. So yes, certainly the why question to start helped identify some root cause issues, but the how questions were far more productive from a standpoint of mapping out a way forward, as opposed to spinning in an arena where you're just as happy to come up with reasons why something's not working.
All right. Can I put you on the hot seat let's just bring up a hypothetical situation and how you might coach someone to overcome a leader that is not really helping the people underneath them. For instance, let's say it's a manufacturing industry, predominantly dominated by men, but this happens to be a female leader, and she's good at operations. She is completely focused on what's in it for the company. Saving money at all costs, making as much money as all costs, and kind of buyer to hell with you, or the customer. It's not about the customer. It's always about us. And a sales leader comes into them and says, listen, it is about them. We have to make sure we deliver to them what they need, on time, on budget, and everything else. It's not about us. We are in service to them. How would you go about coaching that sales leader to get their boss on board to say, look, this is not about us as a brand or a company. This is all about the customer?
Well, I mean, it's more of a philosophy and sort of a cultural thing, right? I mean, it's important for leadership to establish a credo that makes it clear that we are a customer-centric company. Now, if you're a company that spits out, commodities at razor-thin margins, and you're in a highly competitive, but I'll even say in those cases, I have to be a customer-centric company. However, there are some companies that are more of that than others. And assuming that this company is falling within that, I think it's important for the leadership to make that clear. Now, this is a clash of culture, it seems. Like you have sort of the old guard who is commanding control, and they're looking for a cost-cutting, profitable-oriented bottom line that's very short-term focused. Yet you might have sales teams, you have marketing teams, you have frontline teams who see the company as more innovative and more customer-centric. So you have to figure out a way to create those bridges. Leadership has to be on board with that. Now, if they're not on board to say, no, we're not an innovative company, we're not really that customer-centric, so that has to be established. But I would like to think that it would be a company that would be more customer-centric, and that sort of old way of looking at things needs to be reevaluated. Now, it all comes down to what the company's trying to achieve. If they're looking for growth, and if they're looking for stability, and if you're looking for market share, all these things are going to determine different approaches to how they do things. But at the end of the day, every company needs to be focused on the product, the person, the people, the client that they're delivering their product to or their solution to, or they won't survive because somebody else will come along and do a better job. So I think what you have to do in those cases is determine, what are we trying to accomplish here, first of all? And is this process, the profit-focused, cost-cutting process, the most effective way to get there? And that question needs to be then answered. Now, they say, well, yes, it is. Well, let's take a look at the pros and cons to that. And then you continue asking questions. What if this situation? What if this plays out? So you start using hypotheticals, which is a very powerful way to ask questions. And through that sort of thought experiment, hopefully the leader will say, okay, I get your point. It does make sense to sort of reframe how we're looking at this, and therefore increase the idea that we are a customer-centric company, and that will then permeate more so through the culture, and there'll be less of this dysfunction between what frontline teams and sales teams and marketing teams may want and what some dysfunctional leadership may want. Did that answer your question, Park?
Yeah, so you go into it and you ask these hypotheticals as one example to get them seeing your story, the way you picture your narrative around the brand and your customer service approach. You get them nodding. Say, yes, of course we want happy customers. Of course we're innovative. To me, it's about pulling out what are already the adopted values within a company. And to me, it's often right brain, left brain. So a lot of times, they're going to say, well, of course, we value profitability. We want to be sustainable. We want to stay in business. And then they'll pay lip service to the value of customer centricity, the value of always being there on time and on budget for them. They'll kind of pay lip service to that. But if you go in and ask the questions or invite them into some narratives around, look, these are values that we have all agreed to, but we're not really delivering on those from the customer end, then you get that leadership nodding in agreement, kind of almost showing them the errors of their ways without pointing them out and underscoring it's an error of your way, but to get them to arrive at the fact of they're not living up to those particular values around the customer center focused service that they say that they really want to be about.
Well, that's sort of the role of good persuasion, and persuasion, going back to I think this is more Aristotle, the ethos, logos, and pathos approach to being convincing about something. You need to have first, you have to have credibility that you're a good messenger. Second, you have to have some evidence and show that evidence that we aren't what we think we are. And then, of course, the pathos would be the more emotional aspect of what this means to the customer, to the company, to the employees, the story, the heart of the story. So that question-asking process would need to be presented to the leadership, who might give lip service to, of course we're doing this, of course we are this, of course we are that. But at the end of the day, they're not proving it. Well, then it's the job of the rest of the teams to then present proof that, in fact, I know we say we're this, but take a look at this. And here are some examples here. Are we looking at this the same way, or are we seeing things differently? And those questions will then prompt leadership to say, oh, no, we are seeing them the same way, or we're not seeing them the same way. Well, great. Let's talk about that. How should we view the results that we're getting from these customer voice of the customer surveys? How are we supposed to interpret what the salespeople are hearing in the field? So those are questions that then open up, hopefully, a dialogue that'll be productive to slowly shift somebody's point of view. Now, if it's the teams, well, then leadership did a good job in convincing them that they're looking at it incorrectly. But the whole objective would be for everyone to see it the same way, and then to determine, are we okay with this or are we not? And if we're not, where's the gap, and how do we correct the gap? So those are the sort of the directed questions that would need to be asked in those situations, if
Yeah.
that makes sense.
It does. It totally makes sense. I liked where you went with Aristotle. We've got Socrates and Aristotle covered now. I also watched a short video you did on mindset and how powerful it is in really understanding your mindset and then asking the right questions to get you to where you want to go. You've got the thinking, feeling, and observing mindsets. Could you go through those for our listeners?
Yeah, this is a concept that comes out of Zen Buddhism. And the idea is that within each of us, there is a thinking self, a feeling self, and an observing self or a noticing self. We're all very familiar with our thinking selves and feeling selves, and our thinking selves just constantly come up with thought strings on a almost continual basis and chatter within our heads almost incessantly for some of us. There is the emotional self that also kind of pushes and pulls us emotionally through various feelings. Sometimes they're inexplicable, sometimes they're confounding. But then there is this other self that's the sort of the noticing self that essentially observes these two other selves do their thing. And if you can figure out ways to elevate that observing self, you'll be in a better position to manage those thought strings and those unproductive thought processes and those emotional turmoil that often creates also unproductive states of being. And there's ways to could increase that observing self. And I mentioned it in that video, for instance, meditation and journaling and self-questioning. And these are, as I mentioned before, a part of sort of the metacognitive skill set of being able to separate our feelings a bit and our thoughts a bit from our ability to examine them more objectively and being less entangled by them. So many of us are, and all of us have some of this, right? Where we become completely entangled with our anxieties, our thoughts, and our feelings. And it's hard for us to pull out of those states. However, the more you practice this observing self, the more agency you have to say, okay, I am feeling this way, or I am thinking like this, but that's okay. It's over here. It's not who I am. It doesn't define who I am at this moment. So that type of objectivity and separation is where the concept of the noticing and observing self comes from. And from that, Zen Buddhism talks about you're then less susceptible to being pulled in directions that are not productive and don't lead you into positive states of mind. So that's sort of the basic idea.
Yeah, and it goes back to that concept that you started with of know thyself. If you're going to ask better questions, you have to first know thyself. You have to understand yourself. And again, these hidden biases fall into the thinking, feeling, and are outed in the observing mindset, I guess. And that's so correct. If you can embrace those, how do you, the last question on this point, because the observing self, and I do meditation and I try to practice that. And sometimes I ask myself, is what I'm observing really happening, or is what I believe I'm observing is just a story I'm telling myself to overcome something that I don't want to have to take on? How do I know that my observing self is actually telling me the truth?
That's a good question. Well, that's a good question. I mean, hopefully the observing...
Gosh, maybe that's a whole other show, huh?
Right? Hopefully your observing self is the more objective within you that's able to, again, get some little distance between what you're feeling and how you're perceiving it, and then what you're thinking and how you're interpreting it. So there's a thing called the communication wheel that touches on this a little bit, and I talk about it in the book, and it's about how to deal with conflict resolution and dealing with giving difficult feedback. And the wheel essentially keeps the emotion or the thought or the feeling separated by saying, okay, this is what I'm observing. This is how I'm interpreting what I observed. This is how I feel about how I'm interpreting what I observed. This is what I'm wishing and hoping for instead. This is what I'm willing to do to make that happen. So that process, it's sort of a simplified version of the process, gives you that elevated sense of, okay, my behavior is over here, or maybe that person's behavior is over here. It's not who they are, and it's not who I am. It's just a behavior that I have. It's a feeling that I have, but it's not me. It's a thought that I have, but that thought isn't who I am. So it doesn't mean that the thought is necessarily true. It may not be true, and nor might this feeling, because those aren't who I am. They're just reactions and extensions and signals that it's better for me to understand what they are before I get too caught up within them. So it's a little bit of a mind hack to be able to kind of try to comprehend this thing. But meditation, I've found, helps in that sense. And so does journaling, being able to write down your feelings and thoughts, which externalizes them. If you can externalize your thoughts and feelings more, it gives you more sense that they are outside of yourself and that you have more control of them. The more they're attached to you, the more helpless you feel, because you end up just saying, this is who I am. And it's not great, but that's what it is.
Very interesting. Final question for you, Sean. You obviously know your business very well, and this whole idea of the art of asking the right question and know thyself and so on. How much of that has been colored by you growing up as a musician and what you learned and dedicated to yourself as a musician? How much of that do you see that plays across to this much more logical driven business mindset that we're all in, but emotion plays such a huge impact? Just kind of curious.
Yeah. Well, I'd like to think that my early exposure to pretty disciplined art form was certainly sparked by my curiosity. So, I'm naturally curious, so that fed into that. But art and music has a special place within all of us, and accessing that exploration of artistic ideas and musical ideas often requires the ability to ask questions of yourself, of whether you're composing, on how might, a voicing sound different, and imagine how it might sound, and then ask the following questions as to, what makes the most sense with passing tones and other things that related to the chord structures. And then for me, it really bloomed when I started working in the jazz world and working with other jazz players, where the actual communication on stage was often a question answer process, and a beautiful process of discovery that was very much about support and about innovation and about creating new things and about breaking barriers. And it was very much about, in my own head, how about this? How might I do this? What if I try this? And then working with others musically by asking questions musically through the antecedent consequent concept, where you're essentially speaking something and you're responding and you're speaking again. So through that experience, I found a very rich communication environment that also informed my business world. So I was able to kind of bring them together to a certain degree. Also, improvisation was a big aspect of it. And I continue with my workshops applying a lot of these ideas that I learned from the world of music as it relates to not just questioning, but communication in general.
Ah. Well, I totally get all of that. I studied music composition and theory, not to the level that you did, but I have used it throughout my storytelling, my advertising marketing career, and I see everything that you talk about. And the composition of music goes into the composition of a story, goes into the composition of a relationship, goes into the composition of asking the right questions at the right time to get to the final piece of artwork that you are trying to accomplish with your team. So thank you so much for being here, Sean. I really enjoyed it.
Likewise, Park. Thank you so much for having me.
And where can people learn more about you and get your book?
Well, the book is available on Amazon.com currently under The Art of the Question by Sean Grace. You can connect with me on LinkedIn, and you can also connect with me through my website, Peak Luma. That's Peakluma.com.
And what's with the name, Peak Luma?
Peak Luma is the consulting arm of my business, and it's primarily focused on these workshops and leadership development and coaching and such like that. So Peak Luma came out of this idea that we're looking to help you ascend to your highest potential, so peak performance, and Luma is light, so to sort of bring out the brightest within you. So it's a combination of brightness, illumination, enlightenment, along with peak performance and ascension is what it means.
Totally makes sense. And with that, we'll wrap the show. Thanks, Sean.
Thank you, Park.
Thanks for listening and sharing this edition of The Business of Story. If you would do me a huge Halloween favor and jump over to iTunes and give us a rating and review, man, I would hugely appreciate it. It helps us get found in that lousy, noisy world that we all compete in out there. Also, join us next Monday when we are going to have Jane McCarthy with us. She's a brand strategist and co-author of The Goddess Guide to Branding. She shares how you can find the feminine personality archetype of your brand and why it's important for your growth as you authentically differentiate your offering from your competition. And if I can help you and your people excel through the stories they tell, then man, shoot me a note over at park@businessofstory.com, or we have got the ABTs of Storytelling micro-training online course waiting for you over at businessofstory.com/ABT. I mean, there's nothing like uplifting, perfecting your storytelling skills so that your messages land right the first time, every time, and that you can actually influence and persuade people like you never have before. So check them out. And until next Monday, man, I just hope as you grow as a more compelling storyteller that you will remember that the most potent story you will ever tell is the story you tell yourself. So make that one epic. Thanks so much for listening.